Android 4.4 has been around for only 2 months, and if you want to have the latest version of Android, these are pretty much your 3 best choices. But which of these 3 is the best? I'm Andrew with mobileburn.com, here to review the HTC One Google Play Edition, the Nexus 5, and the Moto X, to crown the best Android 4.4 phone. All of these phones run Android 4.4, but they run a different brand of each. But before we get to the software, let's do a quick recap of the hardware because we've already reviewed these phones. With the Nexus 5, you get a very big screen, 4.95 inches. It's 1080p resolution, and the colors look pretty good on here. It's going to be very bright, nice colors. On the back, you'll get a matte finish. It's plastic. It doesn't feel the greatest material in the world, but it feels solid and smooth, and you won't have any problems with it. The buttons are placed a little bit high, and this is a big device to begin with. So some people might be a little uncomfortable with that, but aside from that, it's very good. You've got headphone jack at the top, power button on the right, as well as your micro SIM slot, volume buttons on the left-hand side, and at the bottom, you've got a set of speakers that are a little disappointing. Google has actually revised the manufacturing process to make new devices have a little bit bigger speaker holes, so the sound will carry a little bit more, but the original batch, which I have right here, isn't the best out there. It also has 16 or 32 gigabytes of internal storage, 2 gigs of RAM, and a 2.26 gigahertz processor, the fastest of the trio of the devices that I'm showing you. And I'm sure it's just a coincidence, but the Nexus 5 also happens to be the fastest of these 3 phones. Yeah, I'm sure there's no correlation at all. The Moto X is the smallest of the bunch, but it's also the most comfortable to hold. Because it's smaller, it's a lot easier to access certain buttons, and it's designed to curve along the middle, so it fits nicely in your palm when you cup it. And once you unlock the screen, you still get a 4.7-inch display. Unfortunately, it's 720p, and it's AMOLED, so it's not going to be as a color accurate, but it's still going to look pretty good, even though it has a little bit of a strange tint on the white sometime. But having the AMOLED display also allows you to do something called active screen. When you flip the screen over, you get a little preview of your incoming notifications. So if you've got text messages, you've got Twitter, email, any of those updates, you can get a quick preview once you slide the phone over, which is pretty cool. The Moto X also has a 1.7 gigahertz dual-core processor. Not as fast as the other devices, but still plenty fast. And with that, you get a companion core, which allows you to do extra things like pay attention to sensors. There are a lot of sensor things related to the software that we'll cover in a bit. It also has 16 or 32 gigabytes of storage, 2 gigs of RAM, and a 2,200 milliamp battery. And it's actually the longest lasting battery of the 3 that in terms of what I've experienced. Because it has that lower core processor, it tends to last a little bit longer most of the time for me. The HTC One goes in another direction because this has an aluminum body that feels very nice to touch. In terms of build materials, this is the best of the trio. You've got flat buttons along the side for volume, charging port at the bottom. The power button is at the top. It's a little uncomfortable to get to sometimes, feels a little hard to get to unless you hold the phone pretty high. But other than that, once you get inside, you've got a very nice 4.7-inch display, 1080p resolution. The color profile is a little bit off. Sometimes it looks a little too bright, but overall it's a good display. The buttons you have right here are capacitive. They're back and home. So when you want to do things like check your multitasking, you double tap on the home button. When you want to see Google Now, you hold down and that gets you to the home button. Aside from that, you've got a 1.7 gigahertz processor, quad core as well. It's a Snapdragon 600, the older model, 2 gigs of RAM, 32 or 64 gigabytes of storage, and a 2300 milliamp battery. Now, as I said earlier, these are all Android 4.4 devices, but because the software differs on a few fronts, they can still set themselves apart. So I'll start with the Nexus 5. For one thing, this has a launcher that's exclusive to the Nexus 5. I kind of like it because the icons are a lot bigger. It's easier for me to recognize things sooner, and if I have a lot of apps, it's easy to get to them. Also, when you swipe from the right-hand side, it takes you directly into Google Now, so it's easier for you to have search. Also, when you're on the home screen, you can say, "Okay, Google." Oh, wait, we'll get to that later. Let me get it a little closer to me. And I'll say, "Okay, Google." And you see it appears and allows me to do Google Now searches. But if you notice, I didn't have to be doing anything for the Moto X to do that. Actually, you don't even have to be on the home screen. The device doesn't even have to be on. I can have it off and say, "Okay, Google. Okay, Google. Play Daft Punk." And you see it recognized the command. So if you're ever in a situation where you need the phone to be hands-free and have access to Google Now, that's definitely an advantage that you're going to have over the other devices. The Nexus 5 and the Moto X access Google Now by swiping up or just using the virtual buttons to do multitasking. But the HTC One Google Play Edition has hardware buttons or capacitive buttons, so it doesn't access things that way. You have to double tap or hold down to get to certain places. That's one thing that's different about it. But aside from that, you notice these big front-facing speakers. That's the hook of this device. Hands down, this has better audio than both of these devices. The Moto X has solid volume, but the sound quality is not as good as what you get on HTC One. So that's going to be a big factor for people who use the speakerphone often to listen to music, podcasts, or even if you just use speakerphone a lot. It's a lot nicer to have the boom sound front-facing speakers than it is to deal with the loud but not as good speakers of the Moto X or the LG or Google Nexus 5 speakers that aren't much to write home about in the first place. The HTC One and the Nexus 5 have the same camera interface, and that's a letdown on both fronts because this camera isn't the most intuitive way to navigate and change settings, but that's what you have to deal with when you get one of these stock Android phones or stock adjacent phones. With the HTC One, you get a 4-megapixel camera because this uses ultra pixels. It's designed to let in more light, but you get a smaller image in the end. With the Nexus 5, you get a 8-megapixel camera. And with the Moto X, you get a 10-megapixel camera. But bigger isn't always better because even though you can get bigger photos with the Moto X, it's actually the worst of the bunch in terms of camera quality. You can see some of the differences here in the side-by-side comparisons of these photos, but be sure to click the link in the description below so you can see full-size versions of these photos and see why the Moto X falls behind the Nexus 5 and the HTC One Google Play Edition. The Moto X also has a different camera interface than the other two phones that I just mentioned. For one, it's kind of similar. You can still tap to take a picture, but when you want to get to the settings, you just drag out from the side, and you can turn on HDR, you can turn on tap to focus, so you can control focus and exposure that way. It's a little easier to get to. You just hold down, and then you move up to take a picture. You tap on a different area, and just like that. The software on these three phones are so similar because they're made by people trying to keep Android 4.4 as it was intended. And for that reason, it gets hard to distinguish between them, so it really boils down to the subtle differences that we mentioned before. With the Moto X, you get a few software additions like Moto Assist to help you transfer your old phone stuff to your new. You get some hands-free tools, so when you're driving, if you want to automatically set it, it'll recognize that you're driving and automatically reply saying, "Can't come to the phone right now." With the HTC One Google Play Edition, you get these great speakers. In terms of software, there's not really much setting it apart in terms of Android 4.4. This is a Google Play Edition, so it really doesn't add anything that's unique to this device. The Google Nexus 5, on the other hand, is very unique in terms of the launcher. Other than that, it's pretty much the same thing in what you expect. So you get more out of the Moto X, and you get the newer launcher when you look at the Nexus 5. So of these three, you kind of have to pick which is the best for me. As someone who listens to music a lot on his phone, and same for podcasts, I really am drawn to the HTC One, especially the build material. I'm a big fan of the design of the phone. Sometimes it's hard to get to the top button, but still at the end of the day, I really like it. With the Moto X, you get the most comfortable package, hands down. In terms of the size of the phone, it's my favorite that's been released this year because it's so easy to palm, it's so easy to travel with, and it cups right into your hand. It's the most comfortable that I've had. There are some compromises in terms of speed, but they're not huge differences. Aside from that, you do get the additive things I mentioned, like the auto reply and the assist and all that. So the Nexus 5, not really that unique other than what you can get with the launcher, as I mentioned. So the reason why you would most likely get this is that it's the balance of the three. It's also the cheapest. Even the 32 gigabyte model, which I'm holding right now, costs only $399. The Moto X costs more than $500. I believe it's $539 at the moment. The HTC One is the most expensive of the bunch. When you go in the Play Store, I think it's about 550 as well, maybe 600. I'll clarify that on screen, obviously. But at the end of the day, I think that the Nexus 5 is going to be the most bang for your buck for sure. It's the most balanced option. It's the most comfortable that you can live with, considering what you pay for and what you get out of it. The speaker is a little disappointing, but the newer models reportedly improve that. But anyway, I'm Andrew from mobileburn.com, choosing between the latest Android 4.4 devices. Hopefully this video was helpful to you, and if so, feel free to click like and subscribe. Until next time, thanks for watching.